Hi there, my name's Jonathan Atkinson. I'm from People Powered Retrofit and I also work at Carbon Co-op. And today's webinar presentation, lunchtime session, is going to be on defining place-based retrofit, discussing some of the key elements and case studies. So the webinar today, how do you know you're in the right place? It's for community retrofit practitioners, other retrofit practitioners, not just the community, local authorities and obviously combined authorities, policymakers, both national and local, and indeed some European potentially, campaigners and NGOs, and anyone with an interest in seeing more place-based retrofit take place in the UK and beyond. The session will be about 45 minutes. Please use the chat to introduce yourself. Bear in mind, I will not be able to read the chat as we go, but my colleagues Imi and Monica are both on, and they'll be kind of fielding questions and as we go. We will hopefully have time at the end for Q&A, and it will be recorded. And as I say, I represent both Carbon Co-op and People Powered Retrofit, two organisations, both community-orientated cooperatives based in Greater Manchester, who've worked within that area of place-based retrofit. And this is part of Retrofit Action Week, which we have a GM Retrofit Summit taking place on Thursday, part of Low Carbon Homes kind of schedule of events. So we're contributing to that, and a range of other kind of interested parties and events. So some of the questions we'll address in this webinar is, what do we mean when we talk about place-based retrofit? I know there's a lot of interest, but also a bit of a lack of definition. What are some of the principles that might define place-based retrofit, in our opinion? What are the examples or case studies out there that illustrate this approach, these approaches, and what might we look to do in the sector going forward? And how am I qualified to talk about this? I might not be qualified, but my experience comes over a number of years. I won't go through these in detail, but you're welcome to check them out later. But way back in 2010, Carbon Co-op's original technical partners, Urbed, authored something called the Community Green Deal in the West Midlands, which was all around a place-based approach to retrofit. More latterly, Carbon Co-op more recently completed a 11-team area-based scheme this year, which was a place-based retrofit program of 5 homes, deep retrofitted. We've got experience. I mean, I'm actually old enough to remember CESP schemes, which were the predecessor of ECO back in 2010, 2013. We've been involved, Carbon Co-op, with Connected Places Catapult and Oldham Council in authoring a report. Carbon Co-op also involved in a project, Innovate UK project, with Calderdale Council called the Retrofit Challenge. I've been involved in a lot of policy engagement with DESNES, with ministers, with the Labour Party, National Retrofit Hub. We're also People Powered Retrofit involved in an EU project that's looking about this neighbourhood scale retrofit. And PPR have been involved in delivering quite a few projects in this area recently. What do you mean by place-based? It depends who you ask. Tier ones, big managing agents, housing providers, eco providers, community-led organisations, and everyone in between will have a different take on what place-based means. There is no, as far as I can tell or find, no clear, agreed, universal definition of it. And each of these kind of different interest groups will have their own kind of idea depending on their own, USP. What I've tried to do is take a bit of a step back from that and not, obviously our organisations are community retrofit based, but I've tried to be a bit more, hands back. There are precedents to this. This isn't something that's come out of nowhere. And in many ways, this is about kind of rediscovering kind of models that did work and operate in the past or have been used and maybe have been a little bit forgotten, certainly over the last 10, 12 years. Local authority group repair schemes, which focused on renewal and maintenance, were really popular in post-war period, housing action areas, enveloping schemes. And then certain CESP came along, energy efficiency measures funded by energy companies under their obligation predecessor to eco, and a number of these had more of an area-based approach to them in their delivery, and often with kind of housing providers or local authorities in the mix. And then more latterly, warm zones, collective delivery model, aggregated, again, energy supplier involvement. So this kind of agenda hasn't come from nowhere, and I think there's a lot we can learn from how these schemes were delivered, often very municipally orientated, very local authority coordinated, obviously in a time where local authorities had more capacity, and it often had works teams, on staff, So yeah, a different environment, but lots to learn. What does place-based mean? I actually did a bit of research for this, and place-based as a term is incredibly common. And not just retrofit, obviously. It can be linked to health, transport, regeneration more broadly, all kinds of things. But as I said, there's no agreed definition, which is kind of a plus and a minus. I think it allows people to overlay what they think, but also when we're trying to create a kind of unified policy environment, it's a bit challenging because there's no agreed kind of definition. Often means about focuses on specific characteristics, identity, or needs of an area, and is like opposed to kind of a generic or one-size-fits-all solution. Considers things like geography, culture, history, climate, community, local participation and involvement are kind of promoted, natural landscapes and social systems beyond just houses and assets, and celebrates local identity. So again, it's nice, but it's quite vague. So thinking about place-based retrofit, it's very much on the agenda now. It's being talked about quite a lot in the context of the retrofit warm homes plan, which is pending, as I'm sure most people are aware at this time. And in the engagement and development of the warm homes plan, Desnes and the previous minister, Van Buller, was proactively engaging in this area and talking about place-based retrofit. We'll come on to kind of what that vision might be in a bit, but it's obviously on the agenda, which is why a lot of people are talking about it. And we also see that people like Innovate UK are saying that funding priorities in the next financial year will include things like place-based retrofit and community and citizen involvement in the transition as well. So it's very much now is the time. So as I said, we've been working in this area for quite a while. So we've developed, or we are developing, some principles that we think should underpin the idea of place-based retrofit, because place-based is one thing, but retrofit is another. And to deliver retrofit in a place-based manner requires some principles and underpinning kind of ideas. Otherwise, it's too generic to have any kind of focus or any kind of like momentum behind it. Fundamentally, place-based retrofit, one of the kind of key kind of principles behind it, or kind of drivers behind it rather, is that it's street by street rather than house by house. It's the ability to scale retrofit and deliver it in a way that's not just individual kind of projects one at a time, where you have to do things, front to back, end to end, and multiply that by every single house. The idea is that by taking a street by street approach, we can gain scale and momentum and really kickstart kind of retrofit revolution in the UK. With that in mind, our 4 principles are collective, geographical, aggregated, and intermediary based. Collective, so it's retrofit at scale, is multi-tenure. That's the ambition, at least. And at the very minimum, it's more than one house at a time. So there is an element of houses and people doing this together rather than one by one. It's geographical. All of the stuff we talked about, place-based, all centers around a geographical area, a defined area, and that area, in our estimation, should be informed by people and the built environment. So people who live in an area and their kind of demographics and their kind of particularities, but also a willingness to work with other people in whatever shape or form that takes, but a willingness to be part of a collective scheme. And in terms of built environment, it's about some form of commonality around the built environment, similar types of houses or similar types of measures, or the ability to deliver works within this geographical area. So geography and geographical scale is informed by those two things, people and the built environment. And a lot of, especially in the European project we're involved with, a lot of discussion about what scale are we talking about. And I don't think you can say, oh, it has to be the size of a street or the size of a locality or a barrio if you're in Spain or what have you. What we've talked about is like multiple buildings being kind of minimal kind of interpretation, which includes streets or maybe tower blocks or or high rises or what have you together, but it's multiple. Yeah, aggregated and coordinated. So enabling scale through aggregation. Again, these things flow from each other. If you want a collective endeavor in a geographical scale, you need like some form of aggregation and coordination. And that kind of achieving scale and achieving the benefits of scale come from aggregating. So aggregation could refer to demand, like people. It could involve engagement, aggregating kind of forms of engagement. It could be about commissioning design in a way that's aggregated, delivery in an aggregated form, procurement, training, and finance as well, which I think is super important. And the aggregation, the kind of point of bringing things together is where you realize the benefits. And finally, again, flowing from all these principles, the presence of an intermediary. If you're going to do something collective within a particular area that is aggregated and coordinated, then some form of intermediary is required to enable that aggregation, to coordinate activity, to bring partners together, and to kind of facilitate community involvement and engagement. That's a kind of given. I think intermediaries different entities can play that role. It could be a council or a local authority. It could be a social enterprise, a community retrofit entity. It could be a private sector entity. But I think there needs to be an intermediary that plays this role of aggregation and coordination. An exciting idea for me is whether that intermediary can be some form of partnership or joint venture that can come together to kind of aggregate and bring people together. Perhaps a municipality working with a community organisation or with the private sector. So application of these principles, what does it look like? I think there are different ways. Once you start with those principles, what it looks like flows from there. Some form of geographical zoning, again on the basis of need, or archetypes like drawing the boundaries. The scheme will take place in this area, not in that area. A use of GIS mapping and combining data sets to target retrofit areas. There are different ways to do this. Certainly Carbon Co-op, we've been using GIS tools, but I know there are people looking at specialist platforms to underpin that kind of activity. But that enables the profiling of areas, looking at people and the built environment and making decisions on where to kind of base activity. Engaging a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Again, it flows from those principles, but it's involving a number of entities, organizations, institutions within a locality to enable that place-based approach. Archetype studies to support not only design, but householder engagement and involvement. And this is a particular area of interest for People Powered Retrofit, and I'll share some examples as we go. Innovative blending of funding and financial models. The fascinating thing about the Levenshulme area-based scheme that Carbon Co-op did is only 5 houses and 3 funding sources: grant, loans, and householder contributions. And every single house had a different profile, so a different blending approach. There were no 2 houses the same. And to enable this collective approach, aggregating finance is a real enabler. And I think there's some forms of finance that will enable that as well. local procurement, joint ventures, partnerships. So this kind of aggregated approach tends towards more partnership approaches, but also more progressive and more interesting approaches to procurement and joint ventures. I've already talked about different entities coming together in a joint venture, but I think there's also different approaches to procurement beyond the kind of one size fits all. Let's create a framework for this. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to create the joint ventures and the partnerships coming out of that. And kind of following on from that, local training and skills with an emphasis on on-site, the more program-based and the more place-based that program can be, the better the opportunities to train staff, recruit local apprentices, to give certainty to providers. And obviously, we work very closely with B4Box in the Levantine scheme, which has enabled them to do just that. And use of local materials and supply chains. And we'll hear a little bit about We Can Make in a bit in Bristol, but they're really pioneering biomaterials, very locally oriented. And we know that responsible retrofit done well, often uses vernacular, both kind of housing, but also materials to renovate that housing. And finally, varied strategies to engage the community, ensuring broad participation and feedback. So it's not just about a consultation exercise or flyering some streets to say there's a retrofit thing happening in your area, but more engaged, more involving, or participatory approaches. So I'm going to go through some examples that kind of epitomize these kind of principles and approaches. First one is the Levantine area-based scheme. So this is a project, as I said, it's final completion, practical completion, was in the summer, and it's now in the defects period. This was a collaboration between Carbon Co-op acting as the intermediary and People Powered Retrofit, doing a lot of the energy modelling, B4Box, doing the contracting, and Progress in Practice, who are the project architects and contract admin. Just 5 homes, but an aggregated approach in every sense, and a very place-based approach as well, which involved mapping of the area, profiling, engagement, and ultimately delivery. I think there's quite a few interesting things about this, but the blended finance I've already touched upon. Now, on the left-hand side, that guy there is Ian Runekers, who's worked at the Manchester City Council for many years and has seen a number of these schemes. But he's also in charge of lending and finance in the context of first renewal and maintenance, and more latterly energy efficiency. What the local authority, Manchester City Council, did on this was repurpose a GroupWorks lending product that had previously been used in some of those kind of schemes we talked about, regen schemes, where there was zero upfront cost. The money goes straight to the householder and enables them to finance the scheme or a fraction of the works, depending on the makeup of it. It accumulates no interest, and it's repaid on change of ownership. So it's effectively a charge on the house. For me, I think it's the beginnings of a really effective approach to area-based retrofit or place-based retrofit. A real enabler, so taking away a lot of the kind of worry and hassle around the finance. I think one of the key bits of learning in the last couple of years around green finance is that finance isn't the only enabler by any means, but I think aligned with other sources of advice, targeted advice and delivery, especially supply chain, that it's a real kind of solution, and especially in a place-based kind of context. These are all fuel poor homes. It was an area of fuel poverty, and a number of the householders were defined as in fuel poverty. So some grant makeup there as well. It was a good broad partnership and very collaborative. With B4Box on the right-hand side, you can see an apprentice and a trainer there. They are both a contractor and a training organisation, so they do both functions, which I think is a very potent mix. And they were able to, like, with a program of 5 houses, they were able to like program a training program as part of that, and we benefited from MCS Foundation support for that, which we're really appreciative of. innovative procurement as well of B4Box. It was a negotiated tender. We didn't do what we'd done in the past, which was create a design package and put it out to the market. We had very similar values and approaches to B4Box. So we went through a negotiated process with both boards involved and have signed it, and indeed a long-term partnership. So this is one project, but our ambition is to do more with B4Box. And I think this creates a well-articulated model that can be used in other places. So that's one example. We Can Make, which is, again, a super collaborative, really interesting project in Bristol. I know they've been able to benefit from a mixture of different funding sources, some private, some academic, in fact. It's very community-led. It's really participatory, very place-based. It focuses on the street, but not only the street, but the green spaces around. They've used allotments and green spaces as a point of engagement. They really focus on DIY skills and the use of biomaterials, but they have this broader vision around community regeneration. And this and a few others organisations are involved in Retrofit Connect, which is a project that the National Retrofit Hub are involved with, and it is ongoing, and we're contributing to their community of industry, and I think there should be some really interesting learning coming out of this. Calderdale Retrofit Challenge, I referenced that earlier. It's Innovate UK, Net Zero Living Places funding. This is a collaborative project with Carbon Co-op, B4Box, Carbon Co-op, Calderdale Council, and the Todmorden Learning College, which is pictured here. This took a really interesting approach. There was a lot of engagement and a citizen jury around co-creating a retrofit strategy for that area. I know people have got mixed kind of experiences of citizen jury. They can be costly and technically complex, but the findings from this were really rich and I think a really great basis for further work. I'm going to flag the retrofit guide. And so People Powered Retrofit were commissioned to do this. And we're building on this idea of archetypal design to inform retrofit schemes. So especially in Calderdale, it's West Yorkshire, it's in the Pennines or on the edge of the Pennines, very particular housing type, very some quite particular kind of archetypes here. You can see these back to back. So what we did with this was take a number of archetypes and devise retrofit strategies for each of them. And it's kind of set out here. This is available to download, so by all means go for it. The idea with this is to look at different scenarios for retrofit of these, but to assist decision making and involvement from householders, so they get an idea of how might my home be renovated, what kind of things might go on, and it offers an opportunity for them to participate in some shape or form in the design process. But this then also and like a similar exercise informed the 11-team area-based scheme, but it enables like that specification design phase, again with an idea on place-based and aggregated to save like costs and kind of effort there, but also really importantly to involve householders in that. We've done a few other things. People Powered Retrofit in Saltaire, we worked with Retrofit Reimagined Saltaire, Andrew there, and that was again a very collaborative process of creating some scenarios for what is like area of very high heritage and preserved status there. So it was again both involving people but setting some kind of design principles and enabling either households to procure stuff with being better informed themselves or to DIY retrofit. And we did something very similar in Letchworth. Just finally on the examples, I want to highlight a fantastic report. This Marianne, oh no, actually it was one of our partners in Portugal, Catarina flagged this. It only came out 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, from Climate Action Network Europe, and this is about neighbourhood scale renovation across Europe. And these are some mature kind of schemes, which I think is really inspirational to look at, from France, Sweden, Germany, and Italy. And they're profiled in some detail, and they break down the financing aspect. And I think there are a few different approaches to financing, like an ESCO model, which looks really interesting, energy services company, that can finance the work to kind of public and social housing approaches. Again, coming back to it, and also a recent European networking event we were at, there's a lot of interest in whether finance can go into an area and can be in some way linked to the asset of the house, like a charge on the house, or secured against the house in some way, where you can say there is this financial offer available, there is this retrofit service available, and if you go through that, it's a very simple way to achieve that financing, and to trigger the works. I spoke to in Flanders, in Belgium, there's a lot of work going on retrofit one-stop shops and other things, and I spoke to a municipality there who were really interested in a very streamlined approach, 6-month kind of setup, 6 months delivery, 6-month handover. That's quite ambitious, I think, but it's really good to be aiming for that kind of thing. So no low or no upfront cost. They're different. They are very different models. These, so I wouldn't. They're not all the same, but they all benefit from, or they all demonstrate some form of like engagement, involvement, and participation, and it's really flagged as a success factor in the report. Coordinated training programs in some of them, as we kind of discussed, a potential. And the interesting thing about these are that there's deep renovation. They're not just kind of single measures or just PVs and batteries. They're deep renovation, but there's integration with energy system planning, which I think is something we'll see more of with local area energy planning. But I don't see a lot of consideration about that at the moment. I think the Innovate UK program, the Net Zero Living Places program, might kind of demonstrate more of that kind of stuff. But I think it's interesting. And often these are part of wider regen schemes. So perhaps, and some of them demonstrate kind of new build and then some renovation as well. So I think there's loads to learn from that report. And indeed, I know the author's intention is to influence EU policy making, but I think there's a lot for UK policymakers as well. So those are some examples. We want the principles, how they might be applied, some examples. Yeah, because I don't want people to think this is all plain sailing and we can just go down this place-based and there aren't any kind of challenges, because I think there are. And I know a number of people on this call, I'm sure, will be thinking the same. So a joined-up approach, to a place-based approach, an aggregated approach to retrofit, is one which is totally misaligned with the existing policy environment in the UK, which is really focused on, I'd say, siloed retrofit in different ways. So it might be siloed around specific governance schemes like ECO or SHDF, or might be siloed around 10 years. Like there's a solution for owner-occupiers who are able to pay. There's a solution over here for people that aren't able to pay. And so this idea of place-based is counter to probably like at least 15 years, of policy making. And I think it will be challenging to overcome those. And I don't think it's something that can happen overnight. I think blending finance in particular, there are some real challenges. We know that government schemes in particular, ECO, for example, are very hard to mix with other things. We also know mixing tenures is challenging. There are different drivers there, whether it be an owner-occupier, a private landlord, a social housing provider, different approaches and often different cultures to how they deliver retrofit. We tried to work on the LEV ABS scheme with a housing provider, and although they were really willing, it was very hard to merge our systems and processes and like expectations. So creating these new kind of innovative partnerships is challenging. There are risks on intermediaries. And if we're asking local authorities or community organisations or the private sector to just create these new partnerships, I think that's challenging. And I think there's a lack of kind of available models out there that are kind of well developed. I think we've got some nice theoretical models of things that might have worked in different sectors, but I think we might struggle to say this is a great model for place-based retrofit, a partnership approach. There are barriers to procurement and more progressive forms of procurement, more local forms, more partnership orientated. There are risks, or it's seen as unfamiliar, especially in the public sector, and there are limitations on what can be done. Those kind of area-based tools around like design, planning, mapping, there are some out there, but they're not very mature. Certainly when we've been doing the archetypal stuff, we've been customizing our home retrofit planner tool, which is designed for house to house, but we've been trying to create customizations to make it more effective. So they're not really mature tools out there. I know there's some, but yeah. Project risk, if you're doing collective scheme, there's always a chance that a householder might drop out, or many householders. And if you're trying to run a scheme and that's happening, then the kind of benefits start to wane quite quickly. PAS 2035, I know a lot of public organisations and the government grants are really tied to PAS 2035 as a kind of quality process standard, but it's not designed for place-based. It's not designed for collective approaches, and we've seen that from things like SHDF. And then, running a scheme, there are kind of benefits. There are cost benefits in running a scheme, but there are costs, additional costs in other places. Running that intermediary, doing things like more progressive procurement, being more local, or more engagement as well, there are additional costs. And I think there is probably an open discussion to be had about, are place-based schemes cheaper? Is it cheaper necessarily to do a collective scheme? I think there are cost savings, as I've said, program savings, but there are also additional costs. I think also it's challenging to compare like with like, because there are definitely schemes that are running at the moment where, well publicized, that are not necessarily of the highest quality. So, that's a cheap scheme, but it's not a quality scheme, so that's why I've written there other outcomes, because I think like value for money is what I personally would be looking for from place-based. Value for money that has other outcomes around community engagement, wider like state-led regeneration, improvement to green spaces, improvement to health, all those kind of things, and achieving the outcomes that a lot of retrofit schemes like purport to kind of look to achieve, but are maybe falling short at the moment. So I think there's some knotty questions to ask around, like, are they cheaper? Okay, I'll switch back to my original presentation now. Yeah, so we've looked at kind of, principles, we've looked at kind of opportunities and challenges, we've looked at some examples. What do we know about the Warm Homes Plan? We know it's not published yet, that's the one thing we know. We know that there's been sectoral engagement around place-based in the form of roundtables and some ministerial meetings that happened mostly in the spring. We know that in those meetings there was a kind of phrase used, this is the delivery mechanism of the 2030s, and I think that's kind of appropriate in terms of level of ambition, because we know that it's not there yet, and we know that we will struggle to achieve these principles in the round very soon, next year, the year after. But ramping things up now and informing things, using this period to inform development of this approach in the next 4 or 5 years into a mature kind of model, that makes sense to me. We know that there was an ambition to use combined authorities in some form to coordinate or create partnerships around this. Not really clear on the kind of model for that, but it makes a lot of sense, we know, because a lot of increasing devolution agenda, and a lot of, at least in the West Mids and in Manchester, there is devolution of retrofit as well. And there was a discussion about a role for distribution network operators, which we'd really advocate for because of that wider energy system piece, but also because I think like more market-led solutions to policy outcomes like eco have proved not necessary to meet those policy outcomes. So the DNOs are probably better placed to achieve them, though we know that it will require some change to their off-gem regulation and probably some, change to their capacity and skills. So, and also as part of this kind of what was flagged, really, a role for local community retrofit co-ops and others as part of the mix. So this is kind of what we know, but we don't know whether this has survived the last 6 months or 7 months. And we know that the Treasury has got very much involved in the Warm Homes Plan and is probably one of the main reasons why it's not out at the moment. So we're really looking forward to seeing what is in there. Opportunities available now. I'm just going to speculate really a little bit, just 2 slides on kind of what's to be done. I think there's opportunities here and now to use and test archetype design approaches as part of engagement and delivery. I think we've demonstrated People Powered Retrofit that it's very flexible in different contexts, and I think there are others out there doing similar stuff. And I think the more that we engage in that idea of design within collective schemes, place-based schemes, and involving people and citizens as part of that, the better, really. And I don't think there's much barrier to doing it now, as we've demonstrated. I think we can test different elements of aggregated schemes, like the mechanisms. We've already seen past examples of solar and kind of bulk purchasing and that sort of thing. I think there are pros and cons to those. Sometimes the participants experience delays, but they are potentially a way to open kind of cost savings and other things. And I think we can think in a more ambitious way about like these schemes, like extending them into fabric-based retrofit and other kind of things. I think we can test community-based social marketing. It's something we've advocated for many years. Street-based approaches, community champions, the use and involvement of intermediaries and local institutions as part of that. And I think it's super important to think holistically about community-based social marketing, not just as a kind of, we'll just knock on this street, but thinking about like champion street engagement, institutions, everyone together as part of a collective endeavor, because that's where you reach, we achieve those benefits. And then more generally supporting bottom-up and community-led initiatives. We know through the National Retrofit Hub, there's a huge number of community retrofit initiatives all around the UK and a real desire to do more. So I think we can encourage that in different ways, and through partnership, through funding, and through kind of, trying our own new things out. But I think in all of these things, it's important to be realistic about the current benefits of these kind of approaches and the constraints. And I think ultimately, if we are going to make place-based the mechanism of delivery for the 2030s, we really need to take a policy view on it as well. So yeah, in terms of the Warm Homes Plan, I'm going to move back to my other presentation. God, got them all mixed up. Yeah, in terms of like the Warm Homes Plan, I think there are opportunities there to develop new funding approaches, definitely, and to look at things like eco and whether there can be more like a greater ability to mix and match, really, rather than just say a very narrow take on eco and mix things up. I think funder innovations around this are really important. We're not going to develop these like intermediary partnership, more progressive forms of procurement without the resourcing of officer time within local authorities, or just more time to pilot and test things out, and to create an evidence base. So really, as well as kind of funding capital works, there needs to be fund for revenue, but also fund for innovative kind of schemes and programs that can demonstrate the efficacy of these approaches, and maybe test different things, different types of partnerships, different types of joint ventures. I think there's huge opportunities around devolution and around like a greater emphasis on local authorities. It's referenced there, but through the kind of Leven Team ABS scheme and the Manchester City Council funding, and also a similar scheme in Oldham, there are now some discussions and some test workshops with National Wealth Fund to see whether that approach of local authority lending for retrofit in a place-based fashion, in a way where it's an investment in the asset base, whether that has legs to it. And I think that will require a kind of commitment, a policy commitment from government, not necessarily new funding, but certainly underwriting, because I know like local authority reserves are you know, obviously a concern in lots of different ways. Okay, so back to my other presentation. Just ending really, there is some further reading if you're interested in this, if you want to pick up on other things. There's plenty of sources to go at it. Really recommend like the Community Green Deal, back 15 years old now, but still really relevant into how place-based might work in an area in a partnership manner. And that one at the end, the building by building approach that just came out 2 weeks ago by Climate Action Network. But all these things. And this will be circulated after the meeting. So thanks very much. I think we have an opportunity for questions. Imi, I don't know whether you're able to tee anything up.
Yeah, we have quite a long question from Quentin in the chat, just about the pain points on the aggregate in relation to the aggregation of projects. So there are kind of two aggregation options. A, you navigate in a framework with kind of anticipated estimated number of projects, and B, you activate a single purchase with an aggregated group of projects. So the question is, do you have a perspective on the pros and cons of the two approaches, and do you have any recommendations on one to prefer?
Sorry, could you repeat those models?
Yes, so what I'm reading as is worded, so maybe Quentin might want to chime in a little bit with this, but you navigate in a framework. So for example, pre-negotiated prices, standardized renovation packages with anticipated estimated number of projects, and you activate the individual projects one by one when they're ready. Or B, you activate single purchases with an aggregated group of projects. That's how it's worded.
Okay. I personally, I'm not a big fan of frameworks from past experience, and I think, and also I actually was I lived in council housing for a number of years as well, and my experience of framework projects were on an estate was that they usually ran out before they got to my house, because I lived at the end of the last street. This is kind of part of our argument to look at different forms of procurement, because I don't think the framework model works, and I don't think I think frameworks are a perceived way of reducing risk for the purchaser, but I just think they move risk around, and they don't eliminate that risk, and a lot of the risk gets hidden. By far, our preferred approach is more of the latter, where you're creating a scheme, and we would advocate for negotiated contract. So in the Lev ABS scheme, we developed the scheme with an independent architect and with the contractor, and that was hugely more desirable than a previous tender we'd done. I think like tendering stuff, creating a package and tendering it just creates an adversarial kind of expectation, and it leads to additional costs which are hidden at an earlier stage. And I'm sure there'll be people on the call or watching this who've had good experiences of frameworks, but I see a lot of issues with them. They often are subject to value engineering, in a broad sense, where things get externalized, such as training, which is a nice to have, not a must have, and what we would say is a must have. So I would definitely advocate the latter approach rather than some pre-created idealized framework and then just pulling off the framework. If you can't, you can type your question in the chat. Whilst you're trying to do that, Mel has asked, do you have any examples of anyone doing mixed tenure retrofits well? Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Mel, that mixed tenure is very challenging. One thing I would say is those place-based kind of group works projects I was saying were precedents actually were good examples of mixed tenure. And the classic one would be, and I know from Rusholme here in Manchester, a row of terraces where they were all social housing except for one or two, three or four right to buy. And some of those certain schemes would enable those, like pepper potted as they called them, householders to engage in that social housing scheme. You know, paying themselves or utilizing this lending mechanism to do so. And I think those were really good examples of mixed tenure. The European examples, a number of them are cross tenure within a kind of specific area. So I'd really advocate having a look at those. But yeah, I think it's super challenging. I think the West Yorkshire Combined Authority are doing some place-based pilots, and it's kind of remiss of me not to include them more prominently in the presentation. But I think their ambition is to mix tenure, but they're trying to use different funding mechanisms, and I know there's challenges in that. So yeah, Peter, are you able to unmute? So you were going to ask about financing, investigating mortgages, personal loans, credit unions, community finance offers. Interested to learn more about potential scalability of the approach we've described in terms of local authority lending and property charge with no upfront costs. I mean, yeah, I think like a blended approach and a personalized approach to lending is really important. And so having different products, we had this great product in Levenshulme, which was kind of charge on the house, fantastic. But in one use case, which was like a householder who'd moved in relatively recently, who had relatively little equity and didn't know whether they might move again relatively soon, like it didn't make sense for them because they wouldn't be able to, they'd effectively be in negative equity, you know, because their mortgage to equity ratio. So I think there are dangers there. In terms of the scalability of that approach, I think it's very scalable. And certainly the European examples I was talking to, they were looking, and you know, obviously I think it's part of the discussion around kind of net zero and such, but they were looking at a private sector partner to invest in an area, but investing against the equity assets is like a more secure and more attractive investment for a investor if they feel there is the demand for it and they feel that there will be returns for the householder either in energy savings or in benefits around the retrofit. So yeah, yeah. So I think that is scalable, and I think there's, and I think, and also I know that in a local authority context, in the past there was a lot more local authority lending. So just because in the present day they're very risk averse for lots of really good reasons, and they don't have the capacity, doesn't mean the local authority led approach isn't scalable. Charlotte asks if the principles might be useful. Might usefully be explicit that area-based approaches should be enabling, not coercive, because of difficulties that Mel and others have highlighted around multi-tenure. Yeah, absolutely. Let down from eco. Yeah, and I think, Charlotte, the kind of key thing there is like that idea of community involvement. That's why people need to have trust in the scheme that they're involved with or to be involved with it, you know. And I don't think simply telling them about something that is happening in their area, or here's a leaflet, you can get involved with this, engenders that trust. And I know from being in Preston and having seen that scheme that the Fishwick Road scheme, that like there was engagement done, you know, but it wasn't really engagement and it wasn't involvement. And I think, you know, that is needed more definitely. In terms of Richard, you talk about the Republic of Ireland model. Are you talking about the one-stop shop program? because we have. In fact, we were inspired by visiting Superhomes Island to set up People Powered Retrofit, or that was part of our inspiration. I'm not aware of any like place-based approaches in Ireland, but if you have examples, then we'd love to see them. Yeah, and as Charlotte said, not having a coercive scheme, I think, is really important. So yeah, add to the definition. And Anya, regarding community involvement, to what extent is the community involved, and in what way, and at what stage? Well, I think a successful place-based scheme involves as many partners as possible from the start, not kind of bringing people in at different stages. And I think that needs to be proportionate to the stage, so that at the start you might involve a few people, and then as you go forward, you involve more and more people. There are loads of mechanisms out there for doing so, participatory design and involvement, and I think we can make, and the Retrofit Connect that the National Retrofit Hub are doing offer some great kind of inspiration for that and tools. But I don't, as kind of Charlotte's highlighted, I don't think these are kind of nice to have things. I think they're essential. So yeah, I'll have a look at Killarney, Richard. Yeah, it'd be interesting. I know from engagement with Irish organisations and also with the policy environment there that there's some really interesting things happening. Dave, hi Dave. Is the charge on the house finance model the same as equity release? It's quite. I'm not a financial specialist. I think there are similarities to the model, but I think they are different. But that you'd have to get a more financial practitioner person to say. Two interesting examples. In Manchester, they simply lend the money, it doesn't accumulate interest, and it's repaid on sale or change of ownership. In Oldham, not a retrofit scheme, but repair and maintenance, I believe their mechanism works that there's an appreciation in the value of the house between the time of the lending and the time of the discharging. A proportion of that is paid back to the council. So I think, whilst a lot simpler, clearly the Manchester City Council one to kind of administer, I think there's a lot of benefit from that kind of sharing the benefit of assets accumulating value. So yeah, but there have to be some research whether that is equity release, but it is a form of equity, in some senses. So yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? It's been really productive discussion at the end there. Thank you very much. Sorry about the little glitches in the presentation. I managed to mix up two presentations there, but hopefully you got the gist of it. We'll put this recording, maybe a little bit edited, to remove that online soon. And yeah, do check out Retrofit Action Week in GM, and if you're around in GM, we'll be there on Thursday. So yeah. Thanks very much, and see you all soon.